My name is Brandon Vaughan, and I live in the small one red light town of Gordo, Alabama. I'm the pastor of Little Sandy Baptist Church in Tuscaloosa. I am also the co-host of a gospel radio show called Midday Manna on 96.1 The Blessing, and this is my story of grace. I was born in Gainesville, Florida in 1984. I was separated from my mom at birth. She never even got to hold or see me before I was taken away, and there was no way for either of us to know that it would be 27 years until we finally got that chance.
And in 1984, I was born in Gainesville, Florida to unknown parents. I didn't know anything about my family. And I was in foster care for about 2 or 3 months before my adoptive parents were able to take me back here. I grew up in Tuscaloosa. And I had a great upbringing, great childhood, great parents. I never really thought about my adoption, even though they told me at a young age. At 5 years old, they told me that I had been adopted, and it was good because I was young enough to understand it, but I couldn't really internalize it a whole lot. And as I got older, I grew up in church and got baptized and did the whole religion thing, but it didn't really take effect in my life. It wasn't real to me. I make the joke about being baptized. I went down the old man and came up the wet old man. Nothing in my life changed. And it wasn't until I was 14 years old, I had a friend invite me to church, and I heard the true gospel for the first time. And I was so convicted. And I left that place thinking I'd never come back, but the Holy Ghost didn't leave me. And I didn't know anything about church. I told God that week if He would just get me back to church, don't let me die, I'd give my life to Him. And that Sunday school, the next Sunday I got saved. I didn't even make it to service. And that was July 4th of '99, and I've never been the same. As I got a little older, 15, 16, 17, I began to have questions about my past. I think adolescence is a time where people try to find themselves, for lack of a better term. And for me, I just had more questions than the average person. Where did I get my hair color, my eye color, my personality traits? And I began to wonder, who could just leave a child like that and have nothing to do with them? And I think it's just human nature that when we don't have all the facts, we tend to assume the worst. And for me, it took me to a bad place in my mind, and I just didn't want to think about it, talk about it. I was done. I pushed it to the side. And when I was 17 years old, I never forget, God was calling me to preach, and I felt that draw and that conviction, power of the Holy Ghost. I'll never forget, I was a senior in high school at Tuscaloosa Christian School where I went, and I was in my Bible class, and we weren't doing much that day. We'd finished a test, and I had opened my Bible up, and my excuse to God for not preaching was, I'm an accident, I'm not even supposed to be here. And it just so happened that I turned to Jeremiah chapter 1, and I looked to where, and I saw where God was calling Jeremiah to preach at a young age. And his excuse was, I'm a child, I can't even speak. And God said, before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee. And those 3 words changed my life forever. I formed thee. And I realized that God had just as much to do with me being here as my parents did. And He did have a plan for my life. When I read those words that He said to Jeremiah, it forever changed the way I looked at my life and my adoption, that I did have a purpose, that God did create me, and I was here to serve Him. And so it didn't bother me after that. He would totally set me free of that bondage I was in. Well, I grew up, I got older, I met my wife Leah, and we got married. And I never really even thought about my adoption again until 2008 when my son Wesley was born. And I'll never forget this, and it's amazing how God really does work in mysterious ways. But my son Wesley was born, and of course my wife was exhausted, and the doctors were having trouble keeping his body temperature up. They had to keep him under the heat lamp. And the nurse finally asked my wife, do you want us to take him to the nursery so you can get some rest? And she agreed, and they took him down to the nursery, and I thought she was going to fall asleep immediately, but instead I look over 30 minutes later and she's still staring up at the ceiling. I said, babe, what's wrong? And she began to cry hysterically, and she said, "Bring him back, just bring him back." And I said, "Well, baby, he's 2 doors down in the nursery." And she said, "No, you don't understand, bring him back." And of course, you don't argue with a woman when she gets in that state. And so they brought him back, and I'll never forget when she held him in her arms, she kissed him, she held him like she hadn't seen him in years. And the Lord spoke to me like that, and I realized at that moment that it was something my mom had to do and not something she wanted to do. And it was then that God put in my heart to set out on a quest to find her. So in 2008, I set out to find my birth mother. After much prayer, me and my wife, we just felt like that's what the Lord wanted me to do. And so I called the adoption agency in Gainesville, Florida, where I was adopted out of. And I told the woman who I was. I was born in 1984 and adopted out of their agency. And she said, "Yes, Mr. Vaughan, I've got your mother's information right here on the computer." And I said, "That's great, give it to me." And of course, nothing's ever going to be that easy. And she said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Vaughan, I can't do that." And I said, "What? Why not?" She said, "By Florida law, these records are locked for 99 years and nobody can touch them." And so I said, "You're telling me that you see my birth mom's information right there on your computer and you can't give it to me?" And she said, "That's what I'm saying." And so right then I realized that the mountain I had to climb got a whole lot higher. And I tried looking into private investigators, online reunion registries. The most that anybody could promise me was that it would cost a lot of money, thousands of dollars. It would take at least 2 years, and there were no guarantees because of those records being locked. And so I just said, "God, you're shutting the door. I'm done." And so I didn't think about it again. And in 2011, I was driving down the road in my work truck, and it's like the Lord got in the truck with me. And He just put in my heart to start looking again. And it was so real to me. I remember saying out loud, "God, I already tried everything." And I just felt Him speak to my heart, "Well, just one more time." And so I began to think about any stone that I had left unturned in the initial search. And I remember when I was 15 years old, my adopted mom showed me some paperwork on my birth parents. It was just non-identifying information, hair color and eye color, how tall they were, things like that, nothing useful. But I thought, well, maybe there's something I would see as an adult that I didn't see as a teenager. And so I called my adopted mom. I said, "Do you have those papers?" And she couldn't find them, which is a miracle. She never loses anything. And so I called the adoption agency again, and I asked them if they would send me that non-identifying information. And they said, "Sure, Mr. Vaughan, we'll get that right to you." But a whole year goes by, and I don't get anything in the mail. I don't get any phone call, nothing. And I just said, "God, this is you shutting the door. I'll never look again." I never would have looked again. I was done. So about a year goes by, and it's early 2012, January. And all of a sudden, I get a phone call out of the blue. Didn't recognize the area code, almost didn't answer it, thinking it was a telemarketer, but I answered. And it was a lady from the adoption agency in Gainesville. I'd never talked to this lady through the years. And she said, "Mr. Vaughan, I'm so sorry about this. This is so embarrassing. We were cleaning out the office today, and we moved the filing cabinet, and we saw that your file had fallen behind the filing cabinet. And I see a note here that says I'm supposed to get you this non-identifying information." This woman was different than anybody I'd talked to. And I could tell that she was concerned and she wanted to help me. And I talked to her about 20 minutes about my failed search and everything. And we ended the conversation. She promised to get me that information. Well, 3 days go by, and I'll never forget, I got home one night, and there was a package there that had come in the mail. And I opened it up, and instead of the non-identifying information, it was actually my mother's handwritten information from 1984. And this woman had taken a permanent marker, and she had blacked out everything I wasn't supposed to see. And I don't know if she was trying to help me or not. The truth is, I had 6 pages of information. And out of 6 pages, all I could get was my mother's first name, which was Cheryl, the year she graduated, and her brother's full name. So I got on the internet and began to search for her brother, Doug Heath. And I get on the internet and I type in Doug Heath. There's over 60 hits in the United States, but at the very top, number 1, it said that they were from Winter Haven, Florida, which is where the paper said my mom had grown up. And it said that he had a sister named Cheryl. And I knew that probably had to be it. So I paid $30 to do a background check on that Cheryl. And right there at the top of 14 pages it printed out, it said that her maiden name was Cheryl Heath. And I knew that had to be it. And on page 4 of the background check, I found that I had 2 brothers and a sister. And I began immediately to get on Facebook. And my mom didn't have a Facebook profile at the time, But I looked up my sister Amber, and I found her on Facebook. And I was scrolling through there, and I found a picture of her at her graduation, her high school graduation. And there was a picture there. She had my two brothers, Forrest and Devin, on one side of her, and on the other side of her was my mom. I knew it had to be my mom, and just to kind of put yourself in my shoes, I'm 27 years old, and this is the first time that I'm seeing my blood relatives. And that moment, I mean, I can't even describe what I felt at that moment. And my brother, Forrest, even looked so much like me that I took that picture to my pastor. And I said, "Who do you recognize in this picture?" And he says, "Well, I don't know those people, but that's you right there." I said, "No, that's my brother." And of course, I don't have any brothers up here. And so he said, "Brother," you know, he just didn't understand that, and I explained it to him. And what I did, I got my wife, Leah, to be a mediator. We began to go down the background check, and there were some phone numbers on there. We didn't have any good numbers directly to them, but we began to get in touch with their relatives, and they didn't want to give us any information because they didn't know who we were. But eventually, my wife was able to get a hold of my mom's husband, Ronnie, and she said, "Can I speak to Cheryl?" And he said, "Well, she's not here right now, but can I get her to call you back?" And she said, "No, I'll just call her back." And he said, "Wait a second, what's this about? You know, you a bill collector, you know, what's this about?" And she said, "Well, I can't tell you." He said, "Can't tell me I'm her husband?" And so finally Ronnie says, "Well, I tell you what, if you give me a hint as to what this is about, then I'll get Cheryl to call you back." And my wife Leah said, "Let's just say this is a private family matter." So Ronnie and my wife get off the phone, they end the conversation, and about an hour later Ronnie calls back and says, "Listen, I know you can't tell me anything, but I've been thinking, and I've just got one question for you. Does this have anything to do with 1984? And she said, "Yeah, Cheryl's son is looking for her, and I'm his wife." And Ronnie was like, "Oh my goodness." And he said, "She's always waited for this day, prayed this day would come." And so he goes back and tells Cheryl, my mom. And here's the thing, my mom had never told my brothers Devin and Forrest and my sister Amber about me. They had no idea. And so Ronnie and my wife, they mediated for about 3 days before we ever spoke. She just thought it was the right thing to do to sit down with them and tell them first before she talked to me for the first time. And so they met up at a restaurant one night, and she just told them, "Guys, I know I've told you that I had a pretty rough past," and she did. And she said, "But there's one part that I never told you." And she said, "In 1984, I had a son, and he's found me and wants to try to build a relationship. And I just wanted to see what you thought about that." And to me, that was one of the most unnerving things because I didn't know how they would feel about that. I didn't know if they felt like that I was just trying to get inside their life and try to come between them and her. But they were all fine with it. They were happy about it. And before she ever even got home to call me, they had actually sent me a Facebook friend request, and they didn't just ask me my friend, they asked me my brother. And that really meant a lot to me. So that night she gets home, and she goes out on the porch outside, and she called me, and 27 years old, first time I ever talked to my mom. And I really can't remember a whole lot about the conversation, to be honest with you. It was just like a blur. But we caught up on 27 years, if you can do that in 3 hours. But anyway, as it turns out, she got pregnant when she was a teenager. And it was an embarrassment to her mom. And her mom actually sent her away the whole time she was pregnant. She lived about 2 hours away with total strangers. And while she was gone, my grandmother had prepared a closed adoption, and my mom had no say in the matter. And my mom said from the time that I was born till the time that they rushed me out of the room was less than a minute and a half. She never even opened her eyes because there was nothing she could do about it. She never saw me. And the only thing she remembers is my cry going down the hallway until it faded out and disappeared. That's all she had for 27 years. She grew up and, you know, she got out of the party life. That's really where she was at when she got pregnant. And got married, had kids, and just always prayed for that day to come, that I would find her. And a week after we talked on the phone, her and Ronnie came to see me for the first time. And I was so nervous, probably the most nervous I've ever been in my life. There's no manual for this. There's no book for it. And I remember standing in my kitchen looking at my driveway about the time they were supposed to be there, and I was just so nervous. I would pace around the kitchen. I would look at the clock on the microwave. I'd look outside the window, and I told my wife, I said, look, I don't want any of this to take place outside. I want them to be in here. And I remember when the car pulled up, I thought I was going to pass out. And I saw them get out of the car and walk to the door, and I let them come inside the living room before I walked out and saw them. And I can't describe that moment when I got to see my mom, when we hugged for the first time. And just, I wish I could describe it, but I can't. And of course, she got to see her grandchildren too. She not only saw me, she saw her grandchildren for the first time. My son Wesley and my daughter Allie. And we just tried to pick up where we left off. 27 years later, we spent some time together, went to eat. They could only stay for the weekend. They had to head back. And about a month later, we actually got to go down there. And I got to see my brothers and my sister. And I even got to see my grandmother, the one who had arranged the adoption. And I'll never forget, we had this big get-together at their house. They invited uncles, aunts, relatives, cousins. I mean, it was just like a big family reunion. And me and my brother Forrest, I play guitar and he plays violin. And we got to play together down there for everybody. We played Amazing Grace. And I thought, what a scene that was, really. And right before my grandmother left, she began to hug everyone and say goodbye. And I kind of wondered what I should do. I never met her. I didn't know my place. And without hesitation, the woman that had arranged for my adoption came up to me and no hesitation and hugged my neck and said, I love you. And it wasn't weird, it wasn't strange. It was just like it was supposed to be. And one thing I'd like for people to know about my grandmother, in the book, she's kind of painted as a somewhat mean person. And at that time, she was. But she became a Christian later in life. And about 2 years ago, she passed away. And I got to preach at her funeral. And I preached on the God of second chances. There's a place in Ecclesiastes where Solomon in all his wisdom made the statement that that which is crooked cannot be made straight. But John the Baptist and Luke said when Jesus gets here, he'll take that which is crooked and make it straight. That's what he did. And so I'm thankful for that. As time went on, we began to build a relationship, and it's strange to feel like there's not a 27-year gap there, but that's exactly how it feels. I feel like the son that got married and moved away. And I began to share my faith with my mom. My mom was curious. She had questions, and one day she had actually taken the time to write down questions that would come to her throughout the day. And that night she'd asked me about eternity and the afterlife. And for a solid hour, I took her from Genesis to Revelation. I mean, I was just really preaching to her. And at the end, all she had to say was, well, you've really given me a lot to chew on. And I remember the very first time she came up by herself, it was Memorial Day weekend. She flew up from Orlando. And that Saturday morning, I got up real early and I walked in my living room, and it kind of surprised me. She was already up and she was on the couch reading a book off my shelf. The title of the book was called Eternal Security, How to Be Saved and Know It. And I sat down beside her and she said, how can you do that? How can you really be saved and know it? And I felt God put this in my heart. And I looked at her and I said, Mom, when I was adopted into the Vaughan family, I became a Vaughan forever, and nobody can change that. And I said, when God adopts us into his family, we become a child of God, and nobody can change that. And from that one statement, I saw God remove the scales from her eyes, and she began to weep. And I realized she didn't want to talk about it anymore, so I just let it go and said I'd be here if she had any questions. And the next 24 hours, God was just raking her over the coals. We'd be driving down the road, and she'd be in the back just crying over nothing. God was just dealing with her. The next morning, even in Sunday school, my pastor, Ronnie Blake, was talking about how God adopts children in his family, and she began to cry in Sunday school. He tried to sneak her a tissue, but it was obvious she was tore up. At the end of Sunday school, he said, Cheryl, is there anything you want to talk about? She ran out of the room and held her arms up and said, no. And anyway, long story short, that night she got saved and gave her life to the Lord. And She actually came up a few months later, and I got to baptize her. And I think about in 1984, she had her eyes closed, laying on her back in a hospital bed, and she didn't get to hold me. And yet here in this baptistry, right here at the church where I pastor, Little Sandy Baptist, where we're filming today, and that day, when I got to baptize her, I got to hold her. And what a beautiful picture of God's grace. He's done so many things since then. The Lord has done so many things to bring all this together, so many details that it would take me so long to describe it. Actually, I had to write a book about it. And I want to just tell you what this is about, because people look at this and they say, is this your mother's hand reaching for you? And I said, no, this is God's hand reaching for you. He wants to reconcile you unto Himself. He loves you so much. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life. He wants you to call upon Him like a dependent child today. And if there's anything I want you to know, is that God loves you and He has a plan for your life. It doesn't matter what your past is. It doesn't matter. God can use it for good, just like He did mine. My name is Brandon Vaughan, and His grace is enough.